yes, talking about Abhidharma is always a risk, because you risk basically confirming people's prejudices instead of demonstrating how interesting it is, or how at least I got to do this thing.
That's fine. Is
that on?
Yeah. Okay. So you, instead of demonstrating how interesting it is, you just reveal that actually it's a load of boring old lists, and we can move on. But I hope that will not be the result of today's talk. Just to say something about this title, Mapping the Buddha's Mind. This is a working title of the book I'm writing. It's meant to reflect, it's meant to be clever and multi-layered. Whether it really is, I'm not sure. It's meant to reflect to some extent that the Abhidharma traditions were worked out by the Buddha's disciples in the centuries after his death. So the Abhidharmikas inherited a certain amount of material, and they were trying to systematize it. So in that sense, they were trying to map the Buddha's mind, work out how it all worked. The other aspect of it is, of course, that the Abhidharma, as far as the tradition is concerned, reflects what only a Buddha could work out. It's sort of said that only a Buddha's mind could encompass this analysis and taxonomy of the mind. Without a Buddha's mind, you wouldn't be able to work it out. So I'm trying, in a sense, to reflect both those things. So the mapping of the Buddha's mind is working out what he was trying to teach, but it's also at a deeper level trying to enter the consciousness of a Buddha and see the world from the perspective of a Buddha, as far as the Abhidharmikas were concerned. There are some handouts coming round. Perhaps I should keep one set.
It's
3 sheets.
It's two pages. So one starts with a map, and then the other one.
Oh yeah, the other is on the other side. Yeah. So you've got a. Right, that's right.
I'm not sure we have enough.
So as Tari invited to me speak, what I'm going to do is start off talking in rather general terms about Abhidharma. So forgive me if I tell you things that you already know. So I'm going to make some general comments about Abhidharma, and then move to the way to lists of dharmas that the different schools of Abhidharma produced, and then focus on a couple of examples that, if you like, from my perspective, illustrate something quite interesting when you look at the different schools of Abhidharma and the way that the slight variations in the way they analyze the mind. So, going, as it were, right back to basics in terms of considering the development of Abhidharma literature. Buddhist literature, in effect, begins with the Nikayas or Agamas, the suttas or sutras that begin thus: this is what I have heard, at one time the Lord was staying at such and such a place. These suttas or sutras, which are regarded as, by the tradition, as the word of the Buddha, are of course little spotlights. They're understood to be specific teachings of the Buddha in response to a specific situation, the discourses of the Buddha. We might see these discourses of the Buddha as an initial attempt by his followers to set down what the Buddha taught. But what they end up with is a whole set of discourses that kind of fit together, but don't necessarily obviously fit together. And therefore, the subsequent generations of the disciples of the Buddha, the followers of the Buddha, are left with this problem of, well, you know, we need to produce a system, a proper systematic statement of Buddhist thought. And the earliest systematic statements of the Buddhist thought are basically these Abhidharma schools. So it's always difficult to date material in the Buddhist or the Indian tradition. Let's just say that the Nikayas, Agamas, these first discourses of the Buddha, this first flourishing of Buddhist Indian literature, can date any time from 450 BCE, if we actually push them back into the life of the Buddha. In the form we have them, obviously they probably date from the kind of more like the 3rd or 2nd century BC in the form we have them. We have them in a number of versions, of course, these suttas. We have the Pali versions, we have Sanskrit fragments of the versions primarily of the Sarvastivadins or Mula Sarvastivadins, and we have some in Chinese translation as well. Okay, Abhidharma. So we now move on to Abhidharma itself, this attempt to systematize what is in the suttas or sutras. So just, the word Abhidharma probably comes from a phrase that you find already in the earlier discourses, this phrase Abhidharma, relating to the Dharma, about the Dharma. So Abhidharma is, in origin, a kind of reflection, a secondary reflection on the earlier teachings of the Buddha, this attempt to systematize it. Abhidharma literature divides into two quite distinct phases, if you like. There is what is called canonical Abhidharma, and by canonical in this sense I mean that the tradition says that that certain Abhidharma texts are Buddha Vachana, they are the word of the Buddha. So it gives them the status of, the same status as the earlier discourses of the Buddha, the Nikayas and Agamas, the tradition. Except there was a little bit of an argument about this. And while we can say in simple terms that the whole of the Buddhist tradition accepted that the Nikayas, Agamas, are basically the word of the Buddha, when it came to the Abhidharma text, there was some tension about whether these things were the word of the Buddha. But certainly the proponents, the exponents of Abhidharma regarded them as the word of the Buddha. So that's what I mean by the canonical Abhidharma. Produced, again, it's difficult to know exactly when it was produced. But perhaps we can push some of it back into the 4th century BC. I think that's a little bit problematic, but some scholars see the origins there. 4th century BCE to the end of the 1st century of the Common Era. We then have a whole additional set of Abhidharma literature, which is basically the commentarial or exegetical Abhidharma literature, which starts being produced perhaps from the 1st century BCE, right on in the initial phase until perhaps the end of the 3rd or even to the 4th century BC, 4th century of the Common Era. And of course there's that tradition continues, the tradition of commentarial text, but there's a kind of sense in which the Abhidharma systems are more or less set out in a kind of final form by the end of the 3rd or 4th century of the Era. Abhidharma reflects, as I say, the attempts of disciples of the Buddha to systematize what was inherited. Basically, when we get into the Abhidharma literature, we are definitely getting into what might be called sectarian Buddhism. The Nikaya Agama, the discourses of the Buddha, I think it's quite hard to find real sectarian divisions in that literature. Of course, we have differences when we compare the Pali versions with the Sanskrit versions, with the Chinese versions, the translations. But the difference, it seems to me, are not primarily sectarian. They're to do with the differences in oral literature. It's only really when we get to the Abhidharma literature that we get clear doctrinal sectarian differences. And so we get these different schools of Buddhist thought emerging. So just to give you I mean, traditionally it's said that there were 18 schools of Buddhism. To what extent we should take that number seriously is problematic. But we know there were a number of schools. In theory, all these schools might have had their own version of the Abhidharma, but if they did, it is basically lost to us. So in effect, we have some sense that there were Abhidharma, there were distinctive Abhidharma literatures belonging to maybe half a dozen schools. So I just give you the names on this slide. So we know the Theravadins had an Abhidharma, the Sarvastivadins had an Abhidharma, the Vatsiputriya school, Pudgalavada, had an Abhidharma. The Dharma Guptaka, there's this text called the Shariputra Abhidharma Shastra, which probably belongs to the Dharma Guptaka, but we don't know. And there are references to the Haimavatta and other schools of Mahasangika having their distinctive Abhidharma systems. In practice, we can say that the canonical texts of only 3 schools survive. The 7 books of the Theravada Abhidharma, the 7 books of the Sarvastivada Abhidharma, and if we're right in identifying the Shariputra Abhidharma Shastra as a Dharma Guptaka text, then we have 1 text from the Dharma Guptaka Abhidharma. When we want to study Abhidharma, though, in terms of actually developed systems, in terms of what we actually have information about, we really only have the 3 surviving systems. That's the systems of the Theravada, the Sarvastivada, and the Yogacara. Now, the Yogacara Abhidharma is a kind of, I mean, in very simplistic terms, it builds more or less on the same traditions of the Sarvastivada system, but takes them in a slightly different direction. So it's worth including them in this summary of sort of what we have as Abhidharma. So, just to fill in something more of the background, I'm basically going to talk primarily about comparing the Theravada classification of Abhidharma and the Sarvastivada Abhidharma, classification of mental states or dharmas for the rest of the talk, with a little occasional reference to Yogacara traditions. To place this in a kind of historical context a little bit, this is where you have the map on your handout. In very simple terms, we have the Sarvastivada systems are concentrated in the schools, the figures, the people we know about, the places mentioned in the texts and so forth, are all concentrated in the north of India, northwest India particularly, and the Theravada Abhidharma is concentrated in the south, in Lanka or Tamraparni, as it's sometimes referred to in the texts, this island. So, I mean, I've put some of the names up here, but my map is probably too small, but you've got a kind of version of it which is probably also too small. But you've got so what's now Peshawar, Purushapura up, that's not right, is it? I mean, not Purushapura. And Taxila, places up in the northwest of India, and then down in the south, Anuradhapura, Tamraparni, Lanka. So we've got 2 sort of, a northern school and a southern school of Abhidharma, which to some extent, obviously they have common origins, but at some point they drift apart and they are developing not really in dialogue with each other, although they seem to have some memory of each other's systems sometimes. Another thing to remember is that the flourishing of Abhidharma coincides to some extent with the Gupta period of Indian culture, which is a period of the great flourishing of Indian culture, generally Indian thought, Indian philosophy, Indian literature, Indian poetry. So, now we're going to move to Abhidharma. Why I put this up, of course, is to reflect a basic starting point of Abhidharma. One thing that Abhidharma tries to do. And I think it is a useful analogy to begin to approach Abhidharma, is it's basically trying to get at what one might call the irreducible things that make up reality. I hesitate to call them building blocks or states or whatever. One might say the irreducible events, the fundamental events. I mean, I'm not going to talk too much about what a dharma is, but we're trying to get at dharmas, which are the fundamental events. We must be a little bit careful about understanding them too much as static states or building blocks, using terms like that. Dharmas are dynamic. They are things that happen primarily. They are events. So I prefer to think of them in those terms. So the Abhidharma is trying to identify these. So it basically starts from this premise that the way we normally experience the world is veiled, is covered. We don't see what is actually going on. We project, we impose a whole set of conceptual realities on the world, on our experience. The mind does this. So we need to peel back this to reveal these fundamental events or phenomena that make up the world. So, just as if we wanted to analyze this table, we would be able to, using chemistry, break it down into, basically all that's in this table is certain combinations, molecules and things based on these elements. That's where we would get to if we went with our analysis of what is really here in this table. Okay, but of course that's just a physical analysis. I mean, the important point to understand with Abhidharma is that it classifies reality not just in terms of materiality, the physical world, but also the mental world. So it's trying to do the same thing with the mental world that is done with the physical world in modern chemistry, in reducing things to this periodic table and telling us exactly what elements there are in the universe, the constituents of the universe. Of course, in doing this, in breaking things down, it is continuing a tradition that is already present in the earliest strata of Buddhism. It is building on the tradition of analyzing the world into different categories. So basically it continues with the tradition of breaking reality or analyzing reality in terms of the 5 skandhas or bundles, the 12 sense spaces, and the 18 elements, these things. And I'll say a little bit more about the most commonly used one, the analysis in terms of the 5 skandhas, or the 5 bundles, as I call them, translated as aggregates. So everyone who studies a little bit of Buddhism becomes familiar with this list of the 5 aggregates, basically. But if we look at the Nikayas, what they give us the 5 aggregates: matter, feeling, I call it marking or recognition, sometimes translated as perception, I'm reflecting in a way the Abhidharma understanding in this particular presentation. Matter, feeling, recognition, forces or formations, samskaras, and consciousness. These are the 5 aggregates. Now, already in the Nikayas, you get some attempt to break these categories down. So we're told in the Nikayas that the first bundle consists of the 4 elements, earth, air, fire, and water, plus matter that is dependent, materiality that is dependent on those elements. Feeling is already broken down into pleasant feeling, unpleasant feeling, neutral feeling, physical pain, physical pleasure. Recognition is a dharma in itself. There's no particular analysis, further a breakdown of that. Where in the Nikayas, the samskaras, in the Nikayas, in the suttas, there is already some attempt to give you examples of what sorts of things fit in here. So we have greed and hatred and so forth mentioned as samskaras, things like the 7 constituents of awakening, and the 8 constituents of the path, the Eightfold Path, all the elements of the Eightfold Path are samskaras essentially, the 5 hindrances, and so forth. So we have these that break down examples of these in the suttas. And then finally we have consciousness. So in a sense, Abhidharma does something quite simple. It takes a list like that and it says, well, we need to get this list finalized because it's not finalized in the Nikayas, in the suttas. So we can say that this list is finalized, but when we look at the different final versions of this in the Abhidharma schools, we see that they don't agree. So very briefly, the Theravada comes up with a list of 72 or 82, depending on just how you understand the Dharma. I won't go into that now. But an earlier Theravada text has a list of only 66 dharmas, the Vimuttimagga. The Sarvastivada comes up with a list of 79 dharmas, at least in the way I'm counting it. In later Chinese Abhidharma tradition, they say the Sarvastivada has 75 dharmas, and that's the one that you get in all the textbooks, which probably including mine, which I think is actually wrong. And the Yogacara, well, later on Chinese tradition tells us that the Yogacara now analyzes the world into 100 dharmas, but when you actually look at Yogacara texts, there isn't a list of 100 dharmas. It's vague. Now, the important point to understand here is that when they drew up these lists of dharmas, they had a clear idea of what a dharma was. It's an irreducible phenomenon. But actually the lists that they initially give are open. In the Abhidharma text, they're open. They usually often say at the end, these are the dharmas and whatever other dharmas you've left out or you can think of or we should have put in. The later tradition then says, oh, we know the ones you've left out, we're going to draw a line under here and finalize it all. Though in some cases it's not absolutely clear that it has been finalized. So it's important when you approach early Abhidharma to realize that the lists of dharmas they're presenting are often vague, and that these numbers you get in the textbooks which are taken from later tradition, like Sarvastivada says there are 75 dharmas, Yogacara says there are 100, actually don't reflect what is in the earlier texts. So on your handout, I've given you, just as an example, two sets of dharmas. The Theravada list of 72 dhammas and on the next page the Sarvastivada list of 79. On your handouts you'll see that some appear in a slightly lighter, in grey, whereas some are in black. What that is meant to indicate, the ones that are in black are, on here it's in red. I realise that you're not expected to read it, it's more just to orientate yourself. The ones that are in grey on your handout or red on the slide are the ones that are not in common. they're not in both lists. The ones that are in black and definite are basically common to both both lists. So there's no disagreement about those. But basically, we can see, if you look at these handouts, that there's a broad agreement. If we look at the Theravada list, so we have dharmas, we have certain dharmas under the category of materiality or matter. We have dharmas under the category of mentalities or mental factors, mental functions or capacities. This is chaitasikas or chaitas. And then we have the mind itself, or consciousness itself, and the unconditioned. So we have these four basic categories of dharmas. Just to explain a little bit the relationship between mind and mentalities, or chitta and chaitasika. Mind here is understood as a basic abstraction. It is that aspect of your experience which is aware of an object. Okay? It's the simple function of the mind being aware of an object. In a sense, the idea that you are when you experience reality, you have the sense of being a subject experiencing an object. And chitta refers to that simple experience as an abstraction. Of course, in practice, we can't ever experience that. And for a number of reasons. First, because we're not Buddhas and we can't see the mind like that. But also, it's very difficult because the simple idea, the simple sense of being aware of an object never actually occurs by itself. It always occurs when we are aware of an object, when we have the experience of an object. We always have some of these mental factors or mentalities, these mental capacities or functions. So they always occur in conjunction with being aware of an object. So we always have chitta and chaitasika, mind and mentalities, together in actual experience. And this is where the tradition says the Buddha has done a very hard thing, because it recognizes that when we experience the world, we do not experience it in terms of bits, these separate mental phenomena. We experience the mind as fused together, as integrated. That is how we experience it. So it says, one of the similes it gives is sort of, imagine a perfume in which all sorts of water in which all sorts of ingredients are put into it, different flavors, different plants, herbs, and so forth. They're all put into water, and then the water is shaken together so that it's all fused together, and then someone who of great sensitivity, with a great sense of taste, can sip this water and be quite specific about all the individual ingredients in it. Now, the simile says, well, this is a very, very difficult task. The Buddha, in performing this task with the mind, in being able to extract these elements, has performed a much more difficult task. So that's the basic. So the Abhidharma tradition recognizes that these lists are not exactly precisely how we experience things. But on the other hand, when you look at a list of dharmas and you see something like regret, tiredness, I'm just picking out ones at random, greed, conceit, or doubt, well, we recognize those states in some sense. Obviously, the Abhidharma gives them very specific definitions, and maybe what we jump to the conclusion we jump to about what they mean isn't quite what the Abhidharma means when I give those English translations. it's important to understand that the English translations are kind of tags in which are meant to point towards specific mental experiences that are defined quite precisely in the Abhidharma exegetical literature. If we compare the Sarvastivada and Theravada lists, you see that the Theravada list has 4 fundamental characters: matter, mind, mentalities, and the unconditioned. The Sarvastivada list has 5 fundamental categories. Matter, these dissociated forces or samskaras that are neither mind nor matter, these chitta viprayukta samskaras, they're sort of in between mind and matter. Then it has mind, mental factors, and unconditioned in the same way, but it has this additional category. Could say a little bit about that, but I might come back to it. I want to sort of pass on to just looking at how these Dharma lists evolve by taking one example. The Abhidharma has a basic fundamental problem, and it's not entirely dissimilar from the problem that we might encounter with giving an analysis of this table by chemistry. Okay? So we can take this table and we can say, well, I'm going to do chemical analysis of it. I'm going to reduce it to its fundamental chemical elements. And we can get down to the carbon and whatever that is here. And we could give a list precisely in terms of that. Have we got down to what this table is when we give an analysis in terms of those chemical elements that constitute it? Well, we've got down to the atoms, but we know that atoms are not the fundamental building blocks of the physical world. We can split the atom, so we can get down to subatomic particles. And then, of course, we can go even further. We have, physics discovers new particles. The Higgs boson recently kind of confirmed. And then there's dark matter and antimatter, and where do we stop? Where have you actually got to the bottom of what is actually here? And the Abhidharma has a similar problem. I mean, if we take a very, there's this very ancient example of analysing the person and saying they're like a chariot. We can do the same. We can do the same with a bicycle, right? Well, I've just done it with a table, so I don't really need to repeat it. But, where do we get to the bottom? So this same problem, in a sense, dogs the Abhidharmikas, because they want to get down to the fundamental constituents of reality. But where do they stop? So for one example, we could say, if you look at your lists, you'll see that all the Abhidharmika lists have a dharma called hate. Now, hate means aversion in this Abhidharma analysis. It means the tendency of the mind, when something comes up, to want to push it away, to reject it. So that's what hate is getting at. Aversion might be a better translation. It's dvesha, but sometimes pratiga, this kind of resistance, pushing away. We don't like it. Now, the trouble is, you could just stop there and say, well, that is the fundamental phenomenon, hate, this aversion. But then there are, what about, we might see sub-varieties of hate. So, envy. I hate the fact that someone, has a smarter, more expensive car than me. I dislike that fact. I want one as well, so I don't like the fact that they've got this. Stinginess. I might have, a nice box of chocolates, but I don't like the idea of sharing that box of chocolates with you. I want to keep all the chocolates for myself, so I don't like the idea of your getting your hands on my chocolates. Regret. I think about something I have done and I hate myself for having done it. Anger. I mean, is that just hate? But no. Anger is when you dislike someone, you want them to go away, But then when they don't go away, you get really angry and you yell at them and tell, get away. So are these different varieties? Is this hate or is it different varieties? Now when you look at the Abhidharma lists, you can see that some early lists of dharmas stop with hate. Now that is not, clearly what they're saying is not that those Buddhists who stop at hate deny the existence of envy, stinginess, regret and anger. Of course not. But they sort of think of it as not a dharma, it's just a sub-variety of hate. Most of the lists include envy, stinginess and regret when they develop. But for example, the Theravadins have no dharma for anger. And that's not, I think, because Theravadins don't get angry. They just understand it as a sub-variety. And this kind of problem dogs Abhidharma continuously, if you like. And this is, in a sense, the root of the critique of the Abhidharma. That although it wants to get at the irreducible phenomena that characterize reality, it fails to, it can't. And this is where the classic Madhyamaka critique says, that you're trying to make a dharma a basic, real thing, but actually you can never be sure that you've got to the bottom. It's still a conceptual level of thinking when you start saying hate is the fundamental thing, where you could divide hate, and you could always go on and get sub-varieties. So it's something of a conceptual problem. I think the Abhidharma would tries to redress that in some sense, but it can't fully. In a way, it maybe entrenches itself. But part of its answer is, well, we must... there are two aspects of this. One is the rational philosophical level of what's going on here. The other is the more practical level. It is quite clear that, being able to distinguish, say, envy and stinginess in the way I've just described, and regret in the way I've just described, is a useful spiritual religious exercise in reflecting on what you're doing. So my sense is that we often misread the Madhyamaka critique. It's not saying that these categories are completely useless and we should just put a line through the whole lot of it. It is saying, in a sense, we need to be careful about how we understand their status. But the argument obviously continues in Buddhist thought. Okay. I've given you a handout these lists of dharmas, set out these fundamental phenomena, these events that make up reality according to different schools. They are often then categorized into different groups, and or divided up into different groups in addition to the way they're divided up here. There are all sorts of different sets, if you like, or groupings within the dharmas that you can make, which Abhidharma texts like to do. And one of the most important is this division into kushala, akushala, and aviharkata. Skillful, unskillful, and undetermined. Good, bad, and undetermined. And you see that some dharmas are always good, some dharmas are always bad, some dharmas are always undetermined, and some dharmas may be good, bad, or undetermined according to circumstances. So, for example, a dharma like greed or a dharma like hate is always akushala. A dharma like, so it's not good, it's bad. A dharma like friendliness, a dharma like saddha, shraddha, faith is always good. Then we'll see, if we look at the lists, that sometimes, if we compare Sarvastivadins and Theravadins, they don't always entirely agree about which dharmas may be good and which dharmas are always bad, and which, there's some agreement, but there is some disagreement. And in fact, in your handout, the ones that are in slanted oblique in italics are ones where they disagree slightly about how the categories. Now, I'm going to look at a kind of example of this disagreement presently. But I just want to look at the unwholesome mind in fairly simple terms in the Abhidharma first. First in the Theravada way of looking at it, and then the Sarvastivada. So, the Abhidharma is agreed in saying that there are three basic unwholesome roots of the mind. That these are somehow more fundamental, and that other unwholesome dharmas spring from these three basic roots. So, the three roots are greed, hatred, and delusion, which we might sum up simply as saying, so greed is when we want to hold on to what we're experiencing and want it to continue. Hatred is when we experience something and we want it to discontinue, we want to push it away, so the two basic forces of the mind. Delusion kind of sits in the middle, not knowing. But when we get the system of roots, delusion, in all the Abhidharma system, is understood as the kind of prerequisite of both greed and hatred. I.e., because you do not understand the world properly, how it really is, you have a tendency to hold on to things or push them away. I mean, the basic point is, you don't understand the way the world is, that's delusion, and therefore you think by holding on to the things that you like, you will make yourself happy, and by pushing away the things that you don't like, you will manage to make yourself, you will also manage to make yourself happy. So greed and hatred, though, are premised on a fundamental misapprehension of the way the world is, according to this Abhidharma way of approaching things. So, in other words, we move to this kind of model in the Theravada system of the unwholesome mind. You have the idea that the fundamental unwholesome state of mind is one based on delusion, a misunderstanding of the way the world is. And it's not just absence of an understanding, it's a willful not wanting to know, refusal to actually face up to the world the way the world is. And this delusion, when it's analysed in Abhidharma, always occurs, according to Theravada Abhidharma, with three other states in addition to it. So delusion always has a kind of shamelessness and a recklessness and a restlessness. What that's saying is that there's a fundamental state, a refusal to see the way the world is, that is accompanied by a shamelessness, which in Abhidharma terms is defined as a kind of disregard for the way in which how you behave might affect you, and recklessness, a disregard for the way in which you will behave will affect others. And this fundamental state is, so it's deluded, shameless, reckless, it's also restless. It's somehow intrinsically disturbed. That's the fundamental unwholesome state. Now from that state, you can move either to greed or hatred. So, that basic unwholesome state is the premise of moving to either greed or hatred. So the mind might move to greed, one branch, in the way I've described, but that greed can also take on additional forms in the system. The greed can also manifest as a kind of grasping at opinion, which is view, where we have a fixed idea about things. It can also manifest as an attachment, a grasping at in form of conceit, where we hang on to a particular view of the way we are, as in Abhidharma terms, that we are better, we are worse, or we are equal to other people. The hatred side, well, I've talked a little bit about this, so there's the basic hatred side, but in addition to that, the hatred side may have this kind of envy aspect, stinginess, or regret, these additional things. There may also be, on the unwholesome side, sleepiness and tiredness. And that can accompany being greedy, and it can accompany being hatred, being in a hateful state. In other words, what's being said is that you can feel sleepy in a way that is nice and sleepy in a way that is not so nice. In other words, when you wake up in the morning and it's the weekend and you lie in bed and you realize that you haven't got to get up and do anything, you can just lie there and enjoy that feeling of sleepiness. On the other hand, you can be in a hateful sort of state of mind, an aversion state of mind. Someone can come along and talk to you and whatever. You can be grumpy and tired as well. So that's basically what is being said here. I just want to move to the Sarvastivada model, and I've set it out on this slide in very similar terms to the Theravada model. But what you see there is that it's a little bit complex. In terms of the basic delusion state, they agree that that's there, but they add, in addition to having restlessness, shamelessness, and recklessness, they have all these other things: inattentiveness, lethargy, faithlessness, sleepiness. So it's interesting that what they're claiming is that the fundamental deluded state has even more dimensions to it than the Theravadan state. So they're saying that the fundamental deluded state is inattentive, it's kind of distracted. It is actually a rather lazy state. There's a lethargy in it. It's sleepy, and so forth. So they're filling out the description of that state of mind as a kind of sluggish state of mind that doesn't see things clearly. But like the Theravadins, they say that you could then move from that state to basically a greed state or an aversion state. But when the Sarvastivadins move to this system, they say that, well, you either have greed or you have one of these other things, concealment, which means that you hide the bad things you've done from other people, for example. They have stinginess. Now, they've understood stinginess not as a hate state, but as a greed state. We could try and think about why that is, but they're using the same Pali Sanskrit term, but they're defining it slightly differently. So there's a similarity, but slight variations. And they also have, instead of putting view on the side of greed, they put view as an extra cognitive aberration. They understand it as a kind of additional kind of delusion, if you like, rather than an aspect of the mind grasping precisely at something. These are quite subtle differences that one can unpack, but I'm going to gloss over them now and move on to just say something about two dharmas and the way they're understood in these two systems. Take this one, regret. The Pali word is kukucha, the Sanskrit word is kaukritya. Same word, different pronunciation, you might say. Now, according to the Theravadins, regret is always akushala, unwholesome. So when you regret something you have done, it's accompanied by unpleasant feeling. And it's hating yourself for having done something. So it's hating yourself for having done something bad or having not done something good. It's always bad. That's quite interesting. There's a particular psychological point being made. So you've done something akushala in the past. You've killed someone. You've taken what is not given. When the next day you sit there and you hate yourself for having done that, you're just actually, from this way of approaching it, you're adding to your unwholesomeness. You're just getting worked up about yourself and getting angry. It's not actually good karma, it's more bad karma, hating yourself for what you've done. So it's always bad. If you look at the way the Sarvastivadins analyze this, they say regret has unpleasant feeling, but they say that some kinds of regret are bad and some kinds of regret are good. So if you regret having done something good or having not done something, sorry, I've got it the wrong way round, haven't I? If you yeah, sorry, one gets confused at these points sometimes. Yeah, it should be the other way round. So yeah, so if you regret having done something. Yeah, no, that's right. If you regret having... yeah, that's okay. Sorry, I'm getting confused. So if you regret having done something good or having not done something bad, that is bad. But if you regret having done something bad or having not done something good, that is a positive state of mind. So we could unpack the psychology of that a little bit more, but and we perhaps come back to it and think about it. But
positive in the sense of presence?
Well, it's a good karma. So to regret having having stolen something yesterday, or having had being really nasty to someone yesterday, is here being said. Well, that actually has the opportunity of being a good karma. Whereas the Theravadins have made this thing about regret. Even though it was wrong to be, it was bad karma to be angry with someone yesterday. When I sit there today hating myself for having done that, I'm actually just creating more bad karma. I think that there's an interesting way of unpacking this a little bit in terms of monastic ideas of confession in relation to the patimokkha and so forth. This is why this kind of thing is quite important. I'll leave it as a sort of hanging there for the moment. You wanted to ask is it a...
yeah, it's a question relating to that.
Well, if it's just something that needs a quick answer, I can do it. Or
I think so. I just wanted to ask if the Theravada just didn't think or did not recognize that type of analysis, or did they say, yes, we see the difference between guilt, regret, and remorse, and we still think that all of these are unwholesome?
Well, it's not clear what they're trying to do, so we have to kind of fill in the gaps. I mean, I would suggest that one can see the logic of both, or not just the logic, but one can see the sense of both traditions in a way, that they both make sense. And therefore we have to kind of think about that they've approached a problem and they've taken slightly different routes. But let's come back to it. Perhaps just move on to the sleepiness one. So when we look at the another dharma, sleepiness, we find that in the Theravada tradition that there's an argument and disagreement. Now, some Theravadins say that sleepiness and tiredness are entirely mental and they're always bad. So that whenever you feel sleepy and tired, this is an entirely mental phenomenon and it is unwholesome. Sorry, so that's the way it is. You have to come to terms with it. Now, you can kind of see the logic of what they're saying, because by experience you might be able to reflect and say, well, I'm feeling tired, but we know that sometimes when we're feeling tired, it is to some extent a function of the fact that we're doing something we find boring, it's very interesting, and if suddenly we find something interesting, the tiredness vanishes. We wake up. You can be reading a book and you find the book rather boring and you're falling asleep. You feel your eyes shutting, and then suddenly you read something that, hey, that's interesting, and your imagination is captured in some way. Your mind is captured, and you wake up a little bit. So you can see where they're coming from. Another school of Theravadins, when they approach sleepiness and tiredness, says that sleepiness is mental and bad, but there's another kind of thing which is called tiredness, which is physical. And it's not good or bad, it's of a different category, it's in this undetermined category. And of course you can see where they're coming from. I mean, if you have a really hard day's work, do something really physical, you feel tired mentally. But the tiredness of the body has sometimes gone to the mind. So tiredness, though, has this physical aspect. So you can see where they're coming from. The Sarvastivadins, on the other hand, say that sleepiness and tiredness agree with the Theravadins in saying that it's mental and unwholesome. But they say that sleepiness is, but then they say that there's another thing called tiredness, which is mental, not physical, but can be good, bad, or undetermined. So so you might rather be a Sarvastivadin on this one, because then if you're feeling a bit sleepy and tired, you say, well, it's perfectly wholesome. There's nothing wrong with it. It's not that bad. Okay. How are we doing? What time are we? Well,
we have time.
I'm testing you now. It's always in talking about sleepiness and tiredness.
10 minutes and 15.
Okay, well, I only just go another 5 or 10 minutes just to try and wrap up, to give you, to take this, explore this a little bit through the Abhidharma way of looking at these things. What's interesting is if you actually try and analyze the way tiredness and sleepiness, these words, tina and mita, jnana and mita, are analyzed in the Abhidharma, the definitions they give them, you see that across all these schools, the three, well, I was looking at Theravadins and the sub-school of the Theravadins and the Sarvastivadins, you see that they are using a common terminology in defining these terms. So they talk about sleepiness, tina, the Theravadins, as a sickness and an unworkableness of the mind. They talk about mita, tiredness, as a sickness and unworkableness of the body. And they talk about it as nodding off. They have this sort of image of, when you're sitting there and you're tired, your head falls like this, kind of nodding off. So even the Theravadin definitions, although they say that both tina and mita are mental, when they define mita, they say it's a sickness and workableness of the body. They then do something a little bit, you might say, strange. They say that body here does not quite mean what we mean by body. Body here means, so tina, the first one, is sickness and workableness of consciousness. Chitta, this pure abstract sense of the awareness of the object. Mita is the sickness and unworkableness of the accompanying mental factors. That's what body means here. Okay? But there's a kind of recognition in the tradition of a kind of mind-body relationship going on in the actual terminology. The Sarvastivadin definitions, I'm looking at, for example, Vasubandhu in the Abhidharma Koshe, he defines tina jnana as heaviness and unworkableness of the body and mind. And mita as a feeling of mental compression or oppression or weighing down in some kind of way, a kind of congealing that incapacitates the body in some way. Although he's saying it is mental, it's a mental phenomenon that has this effect on the body. When you have mita, you can't hold your posture together. Again, one's tempted to think that it's talking about references to meditation posture, this idea. But obviously, body, basically when you have mita, you need to have a lie down. You need to lie down, or if you're sitting in meditation, what will happen is you'll slump, you'll find yourself, something like that. So what I'm trying to get at is here, although there's kind of disagreements when you look at the vocabulary, there's both across the schools, there's a concern with mind and body and the interaction between the two. Which is basically what I've got on this slide, so I'm going to pass over that. And now I got up here on this slide something that illustrates that again, that the Theravadins have a whole list of dharmas on the physical side called lightness, softness, and readiness, kamanyata, or workableness. And they have a whole list of mental dharmas with something of a similar, using some of the same terminology. but it's a little bit filled out more. So they have dharmas that are mental, but they call them in the same way as they call sleepiness, unworkableness of the mind, and tiredness, unworkableness of the body. They have kaya pasadhi, which is tranquility of the body, and chitta pasadhi, tranquility of the mind. But they say that the kaya pasadhi there means a mental phenomenon that affects the body. Then they have kaya lahuta and chitta lahuta, lightness of body and mind. But the kaya, the body lightness, is a mental phenomenon that affects the body, corresponding to an actual physical phenomena called lightness. And this works with this softness or mudita and kamanyata, readiness or workableness, and so forth. So you have this crossover of terminology between mind and body going on here. Okay, now it's a quotation from a meditation formula that is found across. This is a common formula found in. It's not a Theravada formula. I'm quoting it in the form that it is found in the Nikayas, but you find it in other texts like Asanga Shravaka Bhumi and so forth, and in the Chinese translations of the Argamas and so forth. So it's a common heritage of all Buddhism, this formula, more or less. So this formula goes, this is the formula which introduces the attainment of jhanas, and it says, when the monk, the meditator, sees that the 5 hindrances have been overcome in himself, gladness arises. When one is glad, joy arises. The body of one whose mind is joyful becomes tranquil. One whose body is tranquil experiences happiness. The mind of one who is happy becomes concentrated. What I find interesting about this formula is this kind of movement. The mind affects the body, and the body affects the mind, but it goes back and forth. Now, you can unpack the terminology here and get back to more of the terms that I've just given you, this lightness, softness, workability, that seem to be associated with meditative states. So what I'm trying to get at is that the Abhidharma is wrestling with their problems at different levels. You know, the problem of actually being honest about being tired and sleepy, the problem of the relationship of mind and body, and back and forth, how they relate to each other. And it's coming to slightly different decisions, but there's a kind. So when you look at the list, you might say, well, they're completely different. But in many ways, what they're saying is quite similar. They're making slightly different decisions about how to classify things, but there's a kind of common language. They're wrestling basically with the same problems that they've inherited through from the earlier tradition, trying to describe something that's important to them, the relationship between mind and body when you are practicing in particular meditation, but also more generally, how our mental state affects how we feel physically, and how our physical state affects how we are mentally. So, I want to finish then with a quotation, which I'll read out, which is where I think part of the problem comes from. And part of the problem that the tradition has, apart from the basic factors that we've been dealing with, the relationship between mind and body, whether sleepiness and tiredness are unwholesome or wholesome, are there occasions when it can be wholesome, being sleepy. Part of the problem is that they reflect on the enlightened mind and the Buddha. And the real problem is that can a Buddha be tired? I mean, you can't really, they want to resist the situation where you go to the Buddha and say, Gautama, I'm having trouble, help me. And the Buddha turns around and says, not now, I'm tired, I want to rest. That is, in some sense, not possible for them to think in terms of. So that's also one issue that they're dealing with. And so the same issues come up when they try to analyse how Buddhas in relation to sleep. So this is the Pali commentarial discussion of this, basically. Remember that according to the Theravadins, where this tradition is coming from, this commentary is coming from, Sleepiness and tiredness are mental, and they are always unwholesome. This is how they try to deal with the problem of a Buddha, because they are referring back. There is a famous saying which is referred to here, that they inherit from the discourses, which they have to accommodate in some sense. They have to deal with. And that is where a Jain monk comes to the Buddha and says, well, when it's really hot, in the hot season, when you've had your meal for the day, do you go back to your kuti, your hut, and have a lie down? And the Buddha confesses, well, actually, that he does. And of course, it's significant that this question is asked by a Jain monk, because the Jain monks can, think that the Buddhist monks are a bit soft for all sorts of reasons. So this is how the commentary deals, though, with this kind of tradition. The sluggishness and drowsiness that usually arises before and after sleep in the case of those in training and ordinary beings is cut off by the path of arahatship. So the sluggishness and drowsiness that you and I have, if you become an arahat or a Buddha, you won't have that anymore. However, on account of the weakness of the physical body, those who have destroyed all defilements, arahats and Buddhas, do enter into bhavanga, that's really deep dream sleep. When this occurs, unmixed with other types of consciousness, they sleep. So they do sleep. They do have this bhavanga. But the point the commentary is making, this is what is termed sleep in their case. Accordingly, the Lord said, the Buddha said, I do recall, Adivesna, this is the Jain, how in the last month of the hot season, having returned from my alms round and eaten my meal, I have spread out my robe, folded it in four, and lain down on my right side, and mindfully and fully aware, gone to sleep. Now the commentary goes on. This weakness of the physical body is not destroyed by the past, and applies to matter that both constitutes and does not constitute a sentient being. In the former case, it applies at such times as when one who has destroyed all the defilements had been on a long journey or is tired after doing some work. So it's okay, you can actually go to sleep after you've done some work. In the latter case, it applies to leaves and flowers, for the leaves of some trees unfold because of the warmth of the sun and fold up at night. The flowers of lotuses open because of the heat of the sun and close at night. But the sleepiness of those who have destroyed the defilements is not the result of anything unskillful. So basically, the way a Buddha or an Arahat goes to sleep is just like a lotus closing at night. It's a kind of natural physical function. It has nothing to do with sleepiness and tiredness. So the Theravadins, in a way, are allowing that there is a physical. You might say that they're trying to have it both ways. That there is this physicalness that allows them.
What was the term for falling asleep?
Well, they're talking about nidra, and swapna. I mean, they're using.
In Sanskrit, sometimes you just can't take a car, lying down and fall asleep. It's not a separate term. So you don't know whether they're relying to simply lying down or whether there's an extra.
Well, they are using. I could get up, but they are using words. They're using both the swapna and nidra in these contexts. So they do call this. Where I put sleep there, it is nidra. Yeah. I was going to talk about making maps, but maybe we'll. You want to talk about? You want to? Okay. This is just fun because I think it helps us understand what Abhidharma is all about. This is my little bit from Lewis Carroll. The point is, when you do Abhidharma, I mentioned this problem that the Madhyamaka critique, if you like. And I think this sort of map thing is relevant to the problem. So this little thing from Lewis Carroll. I'll just read it out. What a useful thing a pocket map is, I remarked. That's another thing you've learned from your nation, said mein Herr. Map making. The we've carried it much further than you. What do you consider the largest map that would be really useful? About 6 inches. Only 6 inches, exclaimed mein Herr. We very soon got to 6 yards to the mile. Then we tried 100 yards to the mile. And then came the grandest idea of all. We actually made a map of the country on the scale of 1 mile to the mile. Have you used it much? I inquired. It has never been spread out yet, said Mein Herr. The farmers objected. They said it would cover the whole country and shut out the sunlight. So we now use the country itself as its own map, and I assure you, it does nearly as well. It highlights the kind of paradox of maps. Borges has this exactly the same idea, that a map with everything on it actually ceases to be useful, and that a map is a model. And I suppose the problem, I think, with Abhidharma is that as long as you see it as a map, it works. But if you mistake it for the country itself, you may get into difficulties. And I think that's something of the tension in the Abhidharma tradition. If it is a map, but like all maps, you have to learn how to read them. And because it's not obvious. I mean, if you give someone a map of, say, the London Underground, you have to know that it works in a particular way, because it is not to scale and the directions are not. But once you know how to use it, it works okay. So, I've talked for a long time, so I should stop. Thank you for bearing with me. Thank you very much.
We have time for your questions.
Yeah. I mean, Jan, and you want to?
Yeah, I was wondering whether the Theravada and the Sarvastiva were locked in their positions once they made it, or was there any influence
Interesting question.
Can you repeat the question, please?
Sorry.
Can you repeat?
So the question was, were the Theravadins and Sarvastivadins locked into their respective positions once they had made them or come to them, or was there any influence? Is there any discussion? As far as I can tell, I mean, there is no explicit discussion between the two groups. There is nowhere in the Theravadin text where it says the Sarvastivadin position is wrong, we disagree with this, or there is nowhere where it's clearly stated. There's an where there is an argument against the position that we can clearly see as a Sarvastivadin position. Certainly not in the particular examples I've been looking at. There is a big dialogue, but an intra-Theravada dialogue between the Mahavihara monks and the Abhayagiri monks about this position of whether there is a physical type of middha. That is documented quite well in the text. But it is this sort of rather interesting thing that the two systems have evolved a little bit separately from each other. And we can't, see direct arguments. So you're going to have you've got my screen saved. Meditator.
I wonder if this disassociated forces you didn't speak about so much, but I wonder if it's a good translation. What are they dissociated from?
They're dissociated from both. So they're chitta viprayukta sanskaras. So they're dissociated from mind. So they're not chaitasikas. They're not chaita or chaitasikas, but if you look at the list, well, they are things that are seen to be needed to make the Sarvastivada system work. So they're the most, well, that's what some of them are. They're sort of philosophical, logical abstractions that help, and in some cases, support the Sarvastivada theory of the three times, like prapti and aprapti, possession and non-possession. Some of them, they support the Sarvastivada theory of the experience, theory of meaning. So there's nama, the name, sentence, and syllable, these kinds of things. So that they're more abstract philosophical ones. Some of them have an overlap. So, for example, you have life, birth, continuity, decay, and impermanence. Those ones, actually, the Theravadins put in the matter category, the materiality category. So the Theravadins recognize those ones, but they put them in a different category. I guess it's the place where the Abhidharma does get more, if you like, scholastic and rationalistic in that kind of area.
Yeah, I was just thinking that maybe what they actually are complicit factors. Maybe call them complicit factors. They do factor in to the mental events, even though they're not themselves mental events.
Yeah.
They still factor in somehow.
I mean, I think that's. I mean, that's. Yeah. I mean, I think in terms of understanding their function, it's good. I suppose I use disassociated simply as a translation of it. Prayukta.
It's an accurate translation.
Yeah, but it's not. Sometimes the accurate translations are not very helpful. Did someone want to come back to the remorse thing, or?
I have a second.
Oh, okay.
Question about the regret. Actually,
Okay.
we're going on from the same discussion about research, because I was wondering, you were talking about two different definitions of regret. And I think in English, maybe one of them will stop being actually regret and will start being maybe blame or something else. So would you use like two different terms in English according to the definitions, or would you use the wrong, like a term that doesn't fit anymore the definition, because you want to point to how it works? It's like
it's a kind of problem because, as you say, so both systems use essentially the same word, kukucha kakritya. So there's sort of bad doing, as it were. But they're both going in slightly different directions with it. I mean, all these words, I suppose the Pali definition, to some extent, it fixes psychologically on what we might call guilt, I suppose, that sort of feeling of guilt. And it's saying that hanging on and carrying around a feeling of guilt is not necessarily helpful. And so it's not so much that the two systems, I think, are taking a different stance on something, that they are actually focusing on a different psychological reality. So for the Sarvastivadins, they're taking Kaukritya as a kind of proper seeing of what you have done badly, something. So you see it and you look at it for what it is, and you feel regret, but you don't feel it. They're trying to distinguish that regret from feeling guilty about it. It doesn't mean that you think it's okay, but they're looking at it in that way. Whereas the Theravadins seem to be focusing on the relationship we have to the bad things we've done, which is that one where we kind of beat ourselves up about it, which actually doesn't get us anywhere. We dwell on it.
They're actually pointing at a little bit different mental states.
Yeah.
Guilt and regret are different mental states. They're not the same.
They're not the same. It's true.
So it's not that they're arguing whether the semental state is wholesome or unwholesome, they're actually pointing
at two different things that are obviously, to some extent, though, related. I mean, psychologically. And I guess sometimes, although there may be experientially, I don't know, it's interesting to reflect on those things, how we experience it. I mean, sometimes there's a kind of clarity about the difference between the two. But I suppose the one striking difference in Theravada Abhidharma is the way they do feeling. Because for the Theravada Abhidharma, mental unpleasant feeling means there must be aversion. There must be hatred, there's pushing away. So you cannot have mental unpleasant feeling with a wholesome state of mind. Now the Sarvastivadins do seem to allow that this regret, which is wholesome, does occur with sometimes something of a bad feeling. It's not pleasant to kind of acknowledge that. So there is a slight difference of approach to the mind there that one could get into a discussion about. But I suppose what I find interesting about these kinds of examples is that you do see the Abhidharma wrestling with real mental states and the subtlety of some of these things sometimes and how we relate to them. I don't know who had that. Okay. 1, 2. Okay.
Just a formal question, it's a kind of formal question. They're talking about feelings, emotions, mental states, and I was wondering whether they ever exemplify with an individual. You know what I mean? Like, suppose you, like, when you speak about it, you always come back to us, right? Like, you feel like that, or you feel like that, and like we share in common some. But do they ever use any individual terms, like the self or sva or whatever? Or is it all abstract, like?
Well, they give examples sometimes of situations to try and help you get a sense of what these things are about. But of course it is an attempt to give a model of the mind, an account of the way the mind works without reference to an underlying enduring self. But they are attempts, as it were, to relate it to experience by giving.
They might say a person, in an example.
Yeah, so they will give a monastic situation. Often they're monastic situations because they are the texts and the examples have clearly grown out of a reflection of monastic life, even though there's a clear claim that the maps, if we did, the list of dharmas is meant to be universal. I mean, all consciousness, not just of human beings, but of animals, all beings in the universe is encompassed by this. There's nothing you can experience that is not on this map. It's all there. So any experience you have will be able to be analysed or accommodated by this.
Small remark about the sleep and regret, when you mentioned the giant monk, right?
Yeah.
It's unavoidable to say, okay, sleep is okay, because otherwise you get guilty or regretful that you...
Well, yes.
It's like, and then you get entangled with...
No, but there are statements that would recommend sleep. You said you're not supposed to sleep, only lie down in the middle of watching the night just for a few hours and maintain mindfulness. There is that kind of statement in the text they have to call it.
And it's also, I think it's a sort of universal of sort of contemplative traditions. I mean, sleep, wrestling with sleep and the practices, the things that are incumbent upon you to do, and that you mustn't be lazy about them. So sleep, in a disciplined religious life, dealing with sleep is kind of something that comes up, I think, quite commonly cross-culturally, I suppose, in different traditions.
Even when you do sleep, it's being fully aware.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, so maybe if you can say a few words about practice, how can you use the Abhidharma format to in the actual practice?
Well, depends what you define as practice. I mean, I teach Abhidharma in an academic context quite a lot, I suppose. I suppose what I would say is that you can't begin, as soon as you start looking at Abhidharma and seriously trying to unpack it, there's a kind of way in which you're doing a certain kind of practice. It encourages immediately a certain kind of introspection about how the mind works and so forth, in order to try and see whether you understand it or whether you think, you might come to the conclusion that this is completely crazy, this is just abstract, logical, rational, scholastic system that hasn't got anything to do with experience or doesn't have anything kind of practical value. But in order to actually reflect on that, you have to introspect, I think, a little bit. So even if you don't consider yourself a Buddhist practitioner, I think there's a way in which Abhidharma is a sort of discipline, where you've got to do a bit of mental observation, and that's one aspect of it. And clearly, the other practice side of it is, I think it is, I mean, the danger is that the map gets taken as reality, but it is a way of framing your experience and kind of noting and thinking and simplifying your experience. I mean, reducing, because the tendency all the time is to say things like, I'm angry because, and you start justifying your anger. I'm angry because someone has said to me this to me, and they shouldn't say this to me because these reasons are important. And the Abhidharma is sort of saying that in a way all that stuff is peripheral. Just see the mental states coming and going. It doesn't matter why you're angry. I mean, in the level we usually give reasons for being angry. It's happening at a deeper level of the mind, not the kind of rationalizations that we give to it.
If I could continue this question.
Yeah.
So it does. The question does arise: how much this is a theoretical system, right, or how much this is a system of meditation? And also, we could also say how much it's devotional in a sense.
Yeah.
In a sense, it's a kind of Buddhology, right?
Yeah.
And these different levels probably overlap. But see, I think if we look at a text like the Dhammasangani, right, or the Abhidhamma Sangaha, or any one of these kind of main kind of doors into the tradition, and they're speaking very much about what we would call alternative states of mind, about jhana, and they're very. I ask myself if how much the system has meaning outside a meditative practice. So the question I think would be, were they? The question would be, were these maps? What were they used for?
I mean, I think there are a number of aspects to this, and you raise a lot of interesting questions. I mean, part of course, relates to what's happening with mindfulness in the last 20 years. The way mindfulness has become, in the form of MBSR, MBCT, has become completely, in certain contexts, secularized. I mean, the Buddhist framework is stripped out, and if you might say that the essence of it is captured and the real usefulness is captured in things like MBCT, and we don't need all this kind of Buddhist mythology and so forth that accompanies it. We don't need this kind of Buddhist devotion that accompanies it. Now, there is a danger, or danger in the sense that, or perhaps danger is the wrong word, but you could approach a system like this, and it, to some extent, works as a straightforward secular map of the mind psychology system. I mean, there is you could narrate it like that, present it like that to some extent. You might find certain difficulties. I mean, where there are things that don't quite fit in. But if you dig a little bit deeper, and it comes up with the MBCT, MBSR discussions about it. I mean, clearly this system is premised on a deep, what one might call ethical structure. I mean, it's very clear that there are akusala and kusala states, and the whole system is orientated towards a certain kind of training and development. You're right that it has these these altered states of consciousness. There's a lot about jhanas. I mean, it's not so obvious when you just look at the scheme of dharmas, but when you, as we say, in the Abhidharma Sangha, Dhamma Sangha, a huge space is developed for these higher states of consciousness, these altered states of consciousness. And of course, what the Abhidharma does, I think, is show you that the states of mind that you have in ordinary states of consciousness, the ones that we normally experience, the dharmas that occur, that we all have now, are not essentially different from the dharmas that occur in these altered states of consciousness. And I think that's one of the important points that it's trying to make, that you can move from ordinary states of mind to quite different states of mind using the tools of ordinary consciousness. I mean, the other thing you mention, of course, is the devotional aspect, and that is, the whole thing is imbued with something that is very easy to forget, which I mentioned at the beginning. That this is only, the whole tradition is very clear, only a Buddha could work this out, which immediately gives it this slightly sacred or magical, or whatever word you want to use, quality, I mean transcendent quality. There's something rather special about dealing with this. And once you've given it that, then of course, even reciting the Abhidharma, it doesn't matter if you don't understand any of it, just reciting the lists of dharmas, and this is a practice that happens in Theravada countries, you just recite the lists. It doesn't matter if you understand it, because so you get a whole different dimension of practice coming from that. So, yeah, we have to be careful or be aware of the implications of what one might call secularizing it, or just representing it as a kind of straightforward, this is psychology, it's the same as others are doing. I don't know whether you...
Do they have any differences, or do they make differences when they are concerned about things that people do or things that people restrain from? Would they have another sort of regret for something done or for something restrained, or do they use the same mental factor?
Well, there's at the moment I can't quite remember what the Sarvastivadins do with this. The Theravadins have a dharma which is restraint, which is a specific mental factor, which arises. So if you think I'm going to steal something, and then in your mind something comes up which prevents you from doing that, that's a virati, this restraint, which stops you from doing that. That's a specific dharma that kind of comes in and stops you. So that's a wholesome dharma. That's not like regret, which is, or guilt or whatever. That's not this kukucha, which is...
and restraining on something that should be done and you don't do?
Well, that wouldn't be restraint. If something that should be done that you don't do, that's...
Maybe
depending on why you don't do it, it's just another unwholesome dharma.
Okay.
If you talk about restraint being pragmatic in the sense of preventing us from doing something bad, you could also say that guilt or regret is something that would prevent you from doing what you did again, and therefore that would also insert a question into this discussion about whether or not guilt or regret can be wholesome feelings or mental states.
Yeah, I think that raises an interesting psychological question from the point of view of Buddhist training. That you might say that, so although guilt, according to the Theravada system, is a unwholesome dharma, to experience guilt is not necessarily always bad in the sense of your progress along the Buddhist path, because obviously if you do something and it makes you feel really bad, and it may be a cause that, as you say, stops you doing it again in the future. So, but according to Theravada Abhidharma, the guilt that you feel, although the effect of the guilt in terms of your progress along the path might actually be beneficial eventually, the actual guilt at that moment is just more aversion and hatred and unwholesome in that way. So there's kind of different layers to perhaps approaching the ethical question.
Well,
yeah, and I was also thinking, how much does the list have to do with behavior? Is it behavioral psychology or? Another big question.
I mean, it's more interested. I mean, I guess the Buddhist thing is the relationship between what's in the mind and what you do, and of course, primarily, I suppose, the Buddhist approach is to give priority to what's in the mind. But then the Abhidharma tries to make a connection between what's in the mind and what you do, such that when certain states are in the mind, it is impossible for you to do certain things, and when you do certain things, are you doing certain things requires certain states as well. But there's a kind of, I mean, this is this issue about whether you can do, could you steal something with a wholesome chittasikas in your mind? Now the Abhidharma tends to want to argue that that's not possible. That you actually, if there is a wholesome state in your mind, you cannot do certain acts. I mean, that becomes a little bit of a debate between, I think, in the Mahayana idea of upaya, whether you...
to what degree is a mental state of motivation at the same time?
Yeah.
I mean, most of these things could be motivating you to a certain action.
Well, I'm not sure how many more students are going to be delving deep into the Abhidharma maps, but I'm sure we